Sandringham Estate sleeps under a clear Norfolk winter sky, temperature dropping to -3 by 2A. The main house, a sprawling red-brick Victorian mansion that served as the royal family's private retreat for over 160 years, sits quiet in darkness, except for security lights illuminating the grounds and the dim glow from overnight staff quarters in the East Wing. King Charles has been in residence for 10 days following the Christmas period, preferring Sandringham's isolation for winter work, reviewing documents, hosting small private meetings, enjoying the countryside that's always felt more like home than any palace. Queen Camilla is with him, as are a handful of essential staff, 2 protection officers, the King's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, working late in the study, 3 household staff and residential quarters, and the estate manager, whose cottage sits 200 yards from the main house. At 2.47A, a protection officer on exterior patrol notices something wrong, a faint orange glow visible through windows on the house's ground floor, east side near the library. His initial assessment is confusion rather than alarm. Perhaps someone left lights on. Perhaps Sir Clive is still working. But the glow intensifies as he watches, and within seconds he recognizes what he's seeing. Fire spreading with horrifying speed through rooms that house priceless historical artifacts, royal correspondence, and more importantly, sleeping human beings in quarters directly above. His radio call to the security command post is calm but urgent, using the emergency codes that activate comprehensive response protocols. Within 90 seconds, alarms shriek through Sandringham's corridors, the automatic fire suppression systems engage, and protection officers are racing toward the King's private apartments on the first floor while calling Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service. Charles wakes to alarm bells and the acrid smell of smoke seeping under his bedroom door. His training, decades of emergency preparedness drills that royals undergo precisely for scenarios like this, overrides initial confusion. He wakes Camilla quickly and they move toward the door. But the protection officer is already there, entering without ceremony and telling them they must evacuate immediately. The fire is in the East Wing but spreading rapidly, and they need to get out now. Charles asks about staff, about Sir Clive, who is working late, about household members whose quarters are in the affected wing. The officer's response is professionally evasive. Everyone is being evacuated. But sir, they need to move now. The King grabs a dressing gown, helps Camilla into hers, and they're escorted through smoke-filled corridors toward the main staircase. The protection officer's body is shielding them from heat that's becoming oppressive, even as they distance themselves from the fire's origin. The evacuation is efficient but terrifying. Staff members emerging from various quarters in nightclothes, some coughing from smoke inhalation, all moving toward the front entrance, where freezing January air provides shocking relief from the heat and acrid atmosphere inside. Charles and Camilla are guided to a Range Rover positioned on the front drive, engine running, ready for emergency departure if the fire threatens to engulf the entire structure. But Charles refuses to leave the immediate grounds, standing outside the vehicle and watching with growing horror as flames become visible through East Wing windows, orange and red light painting the darkness while Norfolk Fire Service's sirens approach from miles away, their desperate wail carrying across the flat countryside. The first fire engines arrive at 3.14A. 27 minutes after the initial discovery, remarkably fast given Sandringham's rural isolation, but an eternity when fire is consuming a historic building with people potentially still inside. The crews deploy immediately, establishing water supplies from the estate's emergency systems and beginning their assault on flames that have now broken through the roof of the East Wing. Charles stands in his dressing gown in -3-degree cold, refusing blankets or shelter, watching firefighters battle to save a building his family has owned since 1862, where his great-great-great-grandmother Queen Alexandra loved to spend Christmases, where his mother came every January until the year she died. But the building matters less than the people, and he keeps asking the same question to anyone who will answer. Is everyone out? Are all staff accounted for? The answers come slowly and incompletely. Protection officers report that the King and Queen are safe, obviously. 2 household staff members evacuated from ground floor quarters are safe, being treated for minor smoke inhalation. The estate manager responded from his cottage and is coordinating with fire services, but there are people unaccounted for. Sir Clive Alderton, last seen working in the ground floor study near the fire's origin. A housekeeping staff member, Margaret Thornton, whose quarters were directly above the library. A junior aide, 28-year-old James Whitmore, also resides in the East Wing. 3 people whose locations are uncertain, whose safety is unknown, while flames consume the structure where they should be. By 4A, the fire is partially contained but still burning fiercely in sections of the East Wing. Fire crews have prevented its spread to the main residence sections, but the East Wing itself, historic library, private study, several residential quarters, is being systematically destroyed. The temperature has dropped further and staff huddle in emergency vehicles while Charles refuses to leave his position on the front drive. Camilla, beside him, wrapped in a blanket someone forced on her, both watching their home burn, while 3 people remain unaccounted for. Norfolk police have established perimeter security, preventing any unauthorized access, but also keeping everyone, including the king, at safe distance from a building that might partially collapse as fire weakens its structure. At 4.32 a fire crew searching the East Wing's ground floor finds Sir Clive Alderton. He's unconscious in a corridor near his study, overcome by smoke while trying to reach safety, his body showing signs of severe smoke inhalation and burns from attempting to navigate fire-filled hallways. Paramedics work on him immediately, establishing airways and administering oxygen while preparing emergency transport to Queen Elizabeth Hospital in King's Lynn. Charles is informed that Sir Clive has been found alive but critically injured, and the relief is overwhelming but incomplete. 2 people still unaccounted for, somewhere in that burning building, are already lost to the flames that have been consuming Sandringham for nearly 2 hours. The sun begins to rise at 7:18 a.m. on a scene of devastation. The fire is finally controlled, no longer spreading, but still burning in isolated sections that crews are systematically extinguishing. The East Wing is a ruined roof, collapsed, windows blown out, centuries of history reduced to charred remains. And in the cold morning light, fire investigators begin the grim work of searching through debris for Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore, whose silence has become its own terrible answer. The discovery. Dawn reveals devastation that darkness had partially concealed. The East Wing of Sandringham House, which stood for 163 years, hosting royalty and housing priceless collections, is effectively destroyed. Blackened stone walls still standing but gutted interior. Collapsed roof, exposing what remains to Norfolk's winter sky. Fire crews continue dampening hotspots while investigators from Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service begin preliminary assessment of origin and cause. Charles and Camilla have been moved to Wood Farm, a cottage on the estate's grounds that served as Prince Philip's final private residence, where they can rest and receive updates without witnessing the continued grim work of searching through rubble. But Charles refuses rest, sitting in Philip's old study with mobile phone receiving constant updates, waiting for news he's increasingly certain will be devastating. The first confirmation comes at 8.43 a.m. Fire investigators searching the collapsed residential quarters above the library have found human remains, a body located in what was once a bedroom, death likely from smoke inhalation before the roof collapse. Formal identification will require time, but the location corresponds to Margaret Thornton's assigned quarters. She was 62 years old, had worked at Sandringham for 18 years, was known throughout the estate for her dedication and warmth. Charles receives this news sitting in his father's chair at Wood Farm, and for several minutes he cannot speak, processing that someone died in his home under his roof while he survived. Camilla sits beside him in silence, because there are no adequate words for this. For the reality that their presence at Sandringham, their need for staff and support, directly resulted in someone being in that building when it burned. The second confirmation comes 90 minutes later. James Whitmore's body is found in a ground floor corridor, evidence suggesting he was attempting to reach the exterior door when he was overcome by smoke and flame. He was 28, had been with the royal household for only 14 months, was considered a rising talent in the private secretary's office, with bright future ahead. His parents are being notified by Norfolk police, even as Charles learns that another person has died because they were serving his household, supporting his private retreat at Sandringham, doing their jobs when fire erupted in the early morning darkness. Sir Clive Alderton remains in critical condition at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, having been transferred from emergency treatment to intensive care burn unit. His injuries are severe, 2nd and 3rd degree burns covering 30% of his body, severe smoke inhalation damaging his lungs, his condition described as life-threatening but stable. Charles wants to visit immediately, but is advised that Alderton is sedated and intubated, that medical staff need time to assess his condition before allowing visitors, and that the King's appearance at the hospital would create security and media complications that would disrupt care for other patients. So Charles waits at Wood Farm while his most trusted advisor fights for life in an ICU 20 miles away. By mid-morning, the news is broken, despite palace attempts to control information flow. A tragedy of this magnitude involving the monarch's residence cannot be concealed, and Norfolk Emergency Services communications have leaked to media. Headlines begin appearing. Fire at Sandringham Estate. King evacuated in early morning blaze. Casualties reported at royal residence. The Palace Communications Office, already understaffed because senior personnel are at Sandringham, struggles to manage the narrative. At 11:30 a.m., they released a brief statement confirming that fire occurred overnight at Sandringham House, that His Majesty and all royal household members were safely evacuated, but that tragically 2 staff members have died and another is critically injured. The statement asks for privacy for the families of those affected and announces that all royal engagements are cancelled indefinitely while the family mourns this devastating loss. The statement's release triggers global media response. Camera crews descend on Norfolk, establishing positions outside Sandringham's gates to capture images of the damaged house visible in the distance. Royal correspondents provide context about Sandringham's historical significance and emotional importance to the royal family. Speculation begins immediately about the fire's cause. Electrical failure in an aging building, heating system malfunction in winter conditions, or more sinister possibilities that investigators will need to rule out. But beneath the speculation is genuine shock and sympathy. The royal family, whatever one thinks of the institution itself, are human beings who've just experienced trauma and loss. 2 people have died serving that family, and a third fights for his life. Prince William arrives at Wood Farm by mid-afternoon, having been notified around 6 a.m. after the immediate crisis was controlled. He finds his father aged overnight, sitting in the cottage that still smells of his late grandfather, processing not just property damage, but the deaths of people for whom he felt personal responsibility. William embraces his father without words because what can be said? That it's not Charles's fault? That no one could have prevented this? The words are true, but unhelpful against the reality that Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore died in a building where they were present solely because the king required staff support. William sits with Charles and Camilla through the afternoon, making calls to coordinate family response and shield his father from immediate pressure to make decisions or public statements. Princess Anne arrives in the evening, driving herself from Gatcombe Park, entering Wood Farm with characteristic directness and immediately asking what needs to be done. Anne's response to tragedy is action. Identify problems, implement solutions, move forward without drowning in emotion that doesn't serve practical needs. She's already been in contact with Margaret Thornton's family and James Whitmore's parents, offering personal condolences and assuring them that the royal family will support them in every way possible. She's coordinated with Norfolk Police about the investigation timeline and with fire services about when the site will be safe for more thorough examination. And she's prepared to shield Charles from obligations until he's capable of resuming them, because regardless of titles and protocol, he's her older brother and he's devastated. By nightfall, the extended family has been fully briefed. Prince Edward, Sophie, and other working royals have cleared their schedules. Prince Harry has been notified in California and has offered to fly immediately if needed, an offer William gently declines, noting that media presence would complicate an already difficult situation and that his physical presence isn't required for the family to know he's supporting them from distance. The focus is on the immediate needs, supporting the deceased staff members' families, ensuring Sir Clive receives the best possible care, determining the fire's cause, and eventually deciding what happens next with Sandringham itself. Charles sits in the cottage where his father spent his final years, looking out at grounds his family has walked for 6 generations, and processes the reality that Sandringham, which has always represented private family life away from public scrutiny, is now the site of tragedy that will forever alter how he experiences this place. 2 people are dead. His private secretary clings to life. And somewhere in the investigation that's just beginning, there will be answers about how a building that's supposed to be maintained to the highest possible standards could burn so catastrophically that 2 people couldn't escape. The king, who wanted privacy and peace, has instead found loss and guilt that no amount of royal resources can ease. The family's Margaret Thornton's daughter, Sarah, receives the notification at 9:15 a.m. from Norfolk police officers appearing at her door in Norwich. She's 34, a teacher, has 2 young children who adored their grandmother's stories about working at the big house where the king lived. The officers tell her gently that there's been a fire at Sandringham, that her mother was caught in it, that she died from smoke inhalation. Sarah's world fractures. Her mother, who called her just yesterday evening to chat about the grandchildren, and mentioned that Sandringham was lovely in the winter quiet, is gone, dead in a fire while serving people whose wealth and security couldn't protect her from smoke and flame in a building that should have been the safest workplace in Britain. The grief is immediate and overwhelming, but underneath it, something else begins to form. Questions about how this could happen. Margaret Thornton was conscientious about safety. She'd mentioned concerns before about old wiring in the East Wing, about heating systems that were being patched rather than replaced, about the general state of maintenance in sections of the house not regularly used by the family. Had those concerns been addressed? Had maintenance been deferred because no royals regularly occupied that wing? Had her mother died because cost-cutting or neglect made a historic building into a death trap? Sarah doesn't voice these questions yet, She's too consumed by raw grief, but they're there, waiting to be asked when shock recedes enough to allow anger. James Whitmore's parents, Richard and Susan, learn of their son's death mid-morning at their home in Hampshire. They're proud parents who'd watched their youngest child achieve his dream of serving in the royal household, who'd listened to his excited phone calls about working at Sandringham, about the honour of supporting the King's private office, about the historical documents he was helping to catalogue. Now police officers are telling them that James died in a hallway trying to escape fire, that his body has been found, but formal identification is still pending, that they'll be contacted about arrangements once the coroner releases him. Susan collapses, literally, her legs giving out as the information penetrates. Richard catches her, both of them sinking to the floor together, and the police officers stand helpless because there's nothing they can do to ease this particular pain. By afternoon, both families are being contacted by Buckingham Palace representatives offering support, financial assistance for funeral costs, counselling services, assurances that the royal family is devastated by the loss. The outreach is well-intentioned but feels inadequate against the magnitude of loss. Money doesn't resurrect Margaret Thornton. Support services don't return James Whitmore to his parents. And the assurances of royal devastation, while probably genuine, don't change that. Two ordinary people died serving extraordinary privilege, and their families are left with permanent holes that no amount of royal sympathy can fill. Sir Clive Alderton's wife, Elizabeth, keeps vigil at Queen Elizabeth Hospital's intensive care unit, where her husband lies sedated and ventilated, his body fighting to survive burns and smoke damage that doctors describe as touch and go. She's been married to Clive for 38 years, has supported his royal service through decades of long hours and endless travel, and now sits beside a bed watching machines breathe for him while his damaged lungs struggle to recover. The King's private secretary isn't just an employee, he's Charles's most trusted confidant, the person who manages the daily complexity of royal life with discretion and dedication. Elizabeth knows her husband will be devastated when he wakes to learn that staff members died while he survived, that his escape from that burning building came at a cost measured in other people's lives. By evening, Princess Anne had taken direct responsibility for family liaison, visiting both the Thornton and Whitmore families personally to express condolences and assure them of continued support. Anne's approach to grief is practical rather than emotional. She provides her direct contact information, ensures they understand what assistance is available, and commits to transparency about the investigation findings once they're available. The families appreciate her straightforward presence, though nothing can make this remotely acceptable. Anne doesn't pretend otherwise. She tells them clearly that two people have died in service to her family, that this loss is unacceptable and will be fully investigated, and that the royal family will honour Margaret and James's memories not just with words, but with genuine care for those they left behind. At Wood Farm, Charles begins drafting personal letters to both families, a task no protocol requires, but that he insists on completing himself rather than delegating to staff. The letters are difficult to write because what can he possibly say that matters against the reality of their loss? That he's sorry? That Margaret and James will be remembered? The words feel hollow even as he writes them, but he persists because doing nothing feels worse than inadequate words. He describes Margaret's dedication and warmth, how she made Sandringham feel like a home rather than just a royal residence. He recalls James's enthusiasm and bright future cut tragically short. He promises that the investigation will be thorough, that answers will be provided, and that their loved one's service will be honoured appropriately. The letters won't ease grief, but perhaps they'll provide some small comfort that Margaret and James mattered personally to the king they served, that they weren't just employees, but people whose loss affects him deeply. William helps his father with the letters, suggesting phrases when Charles struggles to find adequate words, reminding him gently that perfection isn't possible when writing about tragedy. They work together in the cottager's study, father and son processing loss through the only meaningful action available, acknowledging it, honouring it, refusing to let protocol and distance make the deaths impersonal. Catherine arrives in the evening with food from the main house's undamaged kitchen, insisting that Charles needs to eat something even if he has no appetite, providing quiet support through practical care. The family that usually exists under intense public scrutiny is in this moment simply a family dealing with trauma and loss, as any family might, through presence, through practical care, through the small gestures that say, "You're not alone in this." By nightfall, memorial plans are beginning to form. There will need to be a service for Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore, something that honours their service and provides closure for their families. The question is where and when. Sandringham's chapel is undamaged, but feels wrong given that the estate is now a site of tragedy. Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's Cathedral feel too grand for staff members who lived quiet lives of service. Eventually, Anne suggests St. Mary Magdalene Church, Sandringham's parish church, where the royal family traditionally worships during their Norfolk stays. It's appropriate, intimate, and allows the families to grieve in relative privacy while still acknowledging the royal connection that defined Margaret and James's final years. The date is set for January 25th, 11 days after the fire, enough time for initial shock to subside and for coroner's investigations to release the bodies. The service will be private, restricted to family, close friends, and royal household members. Charles will attend, as will other senior royals, but there will be no press access. No cameras, no transformation of personal grief into public spectacle. This is the family's private mourning for two people who died serving them, and that grief doesn't require audience or documentation. The investigation? Norfolk Fire and Rescue Service investigators spend 4 days examining the ruins of Sandringham's East Wing before reaching preliminary conclusions about the fire's origin and cause. The investigation is led by Station Commander Robert Hayes, a 30-year veteran who's examined hundreds of fire scenes, but never one with such historical significance or such tragic outcomes. His team works methodically through the debris, photographing everything, collecting samples for laboratory analysis, reconstructing the fire's progression from origin, point through the building, seeking that crucial evidence that reveals how a controlled household environment became lethal conflagration. The origin point is identified with reasonable certainty by day 2, a ground floor room near the library that housed electrical distribution systems for the East Wing. Historical wiring dating to the 1960s, which has been maintained and patched over decades, but never comprehensively replaced, shows evidence of catastrophic failure. Insulation breakdown leading to short circuit, arcing that ignited surrounding combustible materials, fire spreading rapidly through walls and floors before detection systems registered the problem. The building's age worked against it. Victorian-era construction used materials that, while solid, create pathways for fire spread that modern construction methods specifically prevent. Wooden floors, paneled walls, and accumulated dust and debris in wall spaces provided ideal conditions for fire to move rapidly once ignited. The more damning findings emerge as investigators examine maintenance records and interview estate staff. Sandringham's electrical systems have been subject to ongoing assessment for years, with multiple reports from qualified electricians noting that full rewiring of the East Wing was becoming urgent, but the work had been repeatedly deferred, partly because of cost. Comprehensive rewiring of a historic building is enormously expensive, partly because the East Wing saw limited use and therefore seemed lower priority than more frequently occupied sections. The most recent electrical assessment, completed just 7 months before the fire, had explicitly recommended immediate rewiring and noted that continued use of the existing systems presented fire risk that would increase with each winter season as heating loads stressed aging infrastructure. This recommendation had been reviewed by estate management and flagged for inclusion in the next budget cycle, meaning work would potentially begin in spring 2025, several months after the tragedy. The decision to defer wasn't negligent in the legal sense. It followed standard capital planning processes for large estates where maintenance needs constantly compete for limited funding. But in hindsight, knowing that Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore died because electrical failure in a system identified as high risk sparked catastrophic fire, the deferral feels unconscionable. Station Commander Hayes' preliminary report, delivered to Charles privately before being released to investigating authorities, makes this clear. The fire was preventable, caused by known infrastructure issues that had not been adequately addressed. Charles receives this report in the Wood Farm study on January 22nd, 3 days before the memorial service. Reading it is physically difficult. His hands shake as he processes that 2 people died because work his estate management had deemed too expensive or too disruptive to perform immediately might have prevented the electrical failure that killed them. The report doesn't assign legal culpability. That determination will come from subsequent investigations by Norfolk Police and the Health and Safety Executive. But the moral culpability is inescapable. His home, his staff, his estate management decisions, however indirectly made through advisors and professionals, prioritise budget concerns over electrical safety. William finds his father after Charles has read the report, sitting motionless with the document in his lap, staring at nothing. When William asks what the investigation found, Charles tells him quietly that the fire was preventable, that electrical systems identified as high risk were allowed to remain in service because comprehensive replacement was expensive and seemed non-urgent. William reads the report himself, processing the same guilt and recognition that this tragedy stemmed from institutional decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but now appear catastrophically inadequate. The Prince of Wales considers his own properties Kensington Palace, Anmer Hall, and wonders what maintenance issues exist in those historic buildings that are being managed rather than resolved. What deferred maintenance might become the next tragedy? Princess Anne's response to the investigation findings is characteristically direct. She tells Charles bluntly that he cannot take personal responsibility for every estate management decision made by professional staff, that the deferral of electrical work followed standard processes and wasn't negligent in the legal or even practical sense. But she also acknowledges that the outcome is unbearable regardless of process. 2 people are dead because infrastructure maintenance was inadequate, and the royal family's reputation for maintaining properties to the highest standards has been revealed as aspirational rather than actual. The institution will need to respond with more than sympathy: comprehensive safety reviews of all royal properties, commitment to prioritizing infrastructure maintenance regardless of cost, and transparent acknowledgement that standard capital planning processes proved insufficient. The investigation findings leaked to media within days, inevitable given the number of people involved in the official investigation. Headlines shift from tragic accident narrative to more critical analysis. Fire investigators identified deferred maintenance as factor in Sandringham deaths. Electrical systems flagged as high risk months before fatal fire. Questions emerge about royal estate safety standards. The coverage is respectful of the victims and generally sympathetic to the royal family. But underlying current emerges questioning whether cost considerations or bureaucratic inertia contributed to preventable deaths. The Thornton and Whitmore families, learning through media that electrical problems were known and deferred, begin asking harder questions about accountability and whether their loved ones died because safety concerns were given insufficient priority. By January 24th, Charles decides that the preliminary investigation findings must be addressed publicly before the memorial service. The palace releases a statement acknowledging that electrical infrastructure issues contributed to the fire, that these issues had been identified in assessment reports, and that with devastating hindsight, immediate remediation should have been prioritized regardless of cost or disruption. The statement announces comprehensive safety reviews of all royal properties, immediate implementation of any urgent infrastructure improvements regardless of budget implications, and commitment to full transparency with investigating authorities regarding Sandringham's maintenance history. Most significantly, the statement includes personal words from the King expressing his devastation that preventable infrastructure failure cost Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore their lives, and his commitment to ensuring their deaths lead to meaningful change in how royal properties are maintained and protected. The statement is remarkable for its directness. Royal communications typically avoid anything resembling admission of fault, preferring carefully neutral language that acknowledges circumstances without accepting responsibility. But Charles insists on clarity, telling communications staff that obfuscation and protocol matter less than honest acknowledgement that people died because his estate's maintenance priorities were inadequate. The statement won't bring Margaret and James back, won't ease their family's grief, but perhaps it provides some small comfort that their deaths are being taken seriously and will drive genuine institutional change rather than being quietly managed and forgotten. The memorial, January 25th, dawns cold and clear over Sandringham, the Norfolk countryside frozen and beautiful, despite the tragedy that has transformed this private royal retreat into site of mourning. St. Mary Magdalene Church, the stone parish church where 6 generations of royals have worshipped during their Norfolk stays, fills quietly with mourners. Family members of Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore, close friends, royal household staff, and senior members of the royal family come to honour 2 lives cut short by preventable tragedy. The service is private, no media presence beyond a single official photographer whose images will be released to document the event without transforming it into public spectacle. Charles arrives early, accompanied by Camilla and William, all dressed in formal mourning attire. He specifically requested to greet the Thornton and Whitmore families before the service, a departure from protocol that would typically keep the monarchs separate until the formal proceedings. Sarah Thornton and her children arrive first, and Charles approaches them with visible emotion, expressing personally what his formal letters could only approximate: that Margaret was valued, that her loss affects him deeply, that he carries guilt for her death in his home. Sarah accepts his condolences with composure that barely conceals anger and grief, thanking him for coming, but maintaining distance that reflects her complicated feelings about mourning her mother in the presence of the family she served when that service cost her life. Richard and Susan Whitmore arrive looking shattered, having aged years in the 11 days since their son's death. Charles embraces Richard before speaking, a breach of protocol that feels necessary given the circumstances, expressing devastation at James's loss and acknowledgement that no words or gestures can make this remotely acceptable. Susan asks him directly, her voice breaking, whether the investigation is complete, whether they'll know definitively what caused the fire, and whether anything could have prevented James's death. Charles tells her truthfully that preliminary findings indicate electrical failure in aging systems, that comprehensive investigation continues, and that she and Richard will receive full transparency about findings once official reports are finalized. He doesn't mention that those findings already indicate the fire was preventable, that deferred maintenance contributed to their son's death. That revelation will come later when they're ready to hear it. The service begins at 11 a.m. With hymns chosen by the families and readings celebrating lives dedicated to service and quiet excellence. The Dean of Sandringham delivers a homily about Margaret and James that avoids empty platitudes, instead honestly acknowledging the tragedy of lives cut short, the grief that fills this church, and the complicated reality of mourning people who died serving others. He speaks about Margaret's 18 years at Sandringham, her dedication and warmth that made the estate feel like family rather than simply workplace. He describes James's enthusiasm and bright future, the excitement he brought to his work, and the potential that will never be realized. And he acknowledges carefully but clearly that their deaths occurred in circumstances that should not have occurred. That preventable infrastructure failure cost them their lives, and that the institution they served carries responsibility for ensuring their deaths lead to meaningful change. Charles has requested to speak, another protocol departure that palace advisors initially resisted, but that he insisted was necessary. He approaches the lectern after the Dean's homily, looking out at assembled mourners, and delivers remarks written himself without communications staff polish. He speaks about meeting Margaret during his early visits to Sandringham, about her making the house feel welcoming, about small kindnesses she showed over years of service. He recalls James's enthusiasm when joining the household, his dedication to archival work, his excitement about serving history, and then Charles addresses the harder truth that these two people died in his home. That preliminary investigation indicates the fire resulted from infrastructure issues that should have been addressed, and that he carries personal grief and guilt for loss that occurred under his roof. The remarks are brief but powerful, precisely because they abandon royal distance in favor of honest emotion. Charles's voice breaks multiple times, forcing pauses to regain composure. When he acknowledges that Margaret and James died because safety concerns weren't adequately prioritized, some mourners visibly react, Sarah Thornton crying openly, the Whitmore parents gripping each other tightly. Charles concludes by promising that comprehensive safety reviews will be implemented across all royal properties, that infrastructure maintenance will be prioritized regardless of cost, and that Margaret and James's service will be honored not just with words, but with concrete action ensuring no one else dies because aging systems weren't replaced soon enough. He returns to his seat beside Camilla, who takes his hand, both of them crying quietly as the service continues with final hymns and prayers. The burial services are separate and private. Margaret Thornton interred in Norwich, where she lived her entire life. James Whitmore in Hampshire, near his family home. Charles attends both, accompanied by Anne, standing in cold January cemeteries as two people who served his household are laid to rest. The burials are impossibly sad, made worse by the knowledge that these deaths were preventable, that different priorities or faster action might have meant Margaret and James lived to see this spring. The king, who has spent his life in positions of power and privilege, stands helpless before grief and loss that all his resources cannot undo. Sir Clive Alderton woke from sedation on January 25th. His condition stabilized enough to allow consciousness. His first questions are about the fire, about staff members, about whether everyone escaped safely. Elizabeth must tell her husband that Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore died, that he survived while they didn't, that the building he was working in became their tomb. Clive's response is devastated silence, then tears, then determination that when he's recovered enough, he'll personally ensure that every maintenance issue in every royal property is addressed immediately, regardless of cost or inconvenience. Elizabeth tells him gently that he's not responsible, that he couldn't have prevented this, but they both know the guilt he'll carry regardless. Survivor's guilt compounded by institutional guilt that systems and priorities he helped manage proved inadequate. By February, Sandringham remained closed to the royal family. The damaged East Wing a ruin awaiting decisions about demolition or reconstruction. Charles has not returned since the memorial service, finding the estate too painful to visit when memory of that night pervades every room and corridor. Comprehensive safety reviews are underway at Windsor, Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace and other royal properties. electrical systems, fire suppression, emergency evacuation procedures, maintenance priorities all being examined with renewed urgency. The reviews are expensive and disruptive, but that expense and disruption now seem trivial compared to lives lost because similar work was deferred at Sandringham. The official investigation by Norfolk Police and the Health and Safety Executive continues with final reports expected by late spring. Preliminary indications suggest no criminal negligence. The maintenance deferral followed standard capital planning processes and didn't constitute reckless disregard for safety, but the moral culpability remains, and the royal family's response acknowledges that legal adequacy doesn't equal moral sufficiency. Margaret Thornton and James Whitmore died because systems that should have protected them weren't adequate, and that reality demands more than legal minimum response. By March, Charles had established memorial funds in both names, supporting causes they cared about and providing ongoing financial assistance to their families. The funds are meaningful but feel inadequate against the enormity of loss. Money cannot resurrect the dead or ease the grief of those who love them, but it's what the institution can offer alongside its commitment to ensuring that deferred maintenance never again costs lives. That infrastructure safety becomes absolute priority, and that Margaret and James's deaths drive genuine change rather than being quietly forgotten once initial grief fades. Sandringham will eventually be repaired, the East Wing rebuilt with modern systems and comprehensive safety features. But for Charles, the estate is forever transformed from a private retreat into a site of tragedy and guilt. The building where 6 generations of his family found peace and privacy is now the place where 2 people died because priorities weren't adequate and systems weren't sufficient. That reality cannot be rebuilt or repaired, only acknowledged and carried forward as motivation for ensuring such tragedy never happens again. This fictional narrative explores how privilege and power cannot prevent tragedy and how institutions must respond when preventable failures cost lives. The fire at Sandringham reveals that even royal resources cannot ensure safety when maintenance is deferred and infrastructure is aging. Subscribe for more stories examining the human cost behind institutional failures. Like and share if this resonated, because even palaces burn when safety becomes negotiable.